On a freezing winter night, New York City caught fire. The cold was so severe that water froze inside the fire hoses. Firefighters could only watch as flames spread from building to building. By the time morning arrived, hundreds of buildings were gone. Entire neighborhoods had vanished.
Imagine a city built on a promise. This is the story of New York in the early 19th century, a place of explosive growth, where ambition was the foundation and wood was the primary building material. Narrow, winding streets carved through neighborhoods where buildings stood crammed together, almost touching. Along the East River, warehouses bulged with everything flammable you can think of: cotton, alcohol, oil, and expensive imported goods. Fire was a known risk, but New Yorkers had a certain swagger about it. They'd seen fires before, big ones even, and they always bounced back. They believed they were fireproof, invincible. But in December of 1835, that confidence was about to be tested by a force of nature they could never have imagined. The winter of 1835 was brutal, one of the coldest New York had ever endured. The East River froze over, a solid sheet of ice. The Hudson River was a frozen highway. The wind wasn't just cold, it was a physical force, slicing through the narrow streets like a razor. Just breathing the frigid air felt heavy and difficult. It was on one of these impossibly cold nights, December 16th, that the city's worst nightmare began. Deep within a 5-story warehouse near the East River, a tiny spark ignited. The exact cause, whether a burst gas pipe or a coal stove, was lost to history. But it didn't matter how it started. What mattered was where. The warehouse was a tinderbox, packed to the ceiling with flammable goods. In minutes, a small flicker became a raging inferno. Normally, the city's volunteer firefighters would have been on the scene quickly. But this was no normal night. The bitter cold was a powerful ally to the fire. As the alarm bells rang out, their sound muffled by the dense, freezing air, firefighters raced to the scene only to face an impossible battle. Their first and most critical weapon, water, was useless. The hydrants were frozen solid. When they managed to cut holes in the ice of the East River, the water they drew froze inside the hoses before it could even reach the nozzles. The leather hoses themselves became stiff and cracked in the Arctic temperatures. Water pumps failed, their mechanisms frozen. Everything was working against them. And then there was the wind. A relentless, gale-force wind swept in from the northwest, fanning the flames and turning the fire into a self-propelling monster. It pushed the inferno away from the river and deeper into the heart of the city's financial district. The fire didn't just spread. It leaped. Embers the size of your hand were carried by the wind, soaring through the night sky like fiery meteors. They landed on the wooden rooftops of buildings, blocks away, instantly starting new fires. The blaze wasn't just one fire anymore. It was a swarm, multiplying and consuming everything in its path. The firefighters, brave as they were utterly overwhelmed. They were fighting a firestorm with frozen tools in a city that seemed determined to burn. As the fire grew, it developed a terrifying life of its own. The intense heat created its own weather system, sucking in more oxygen and fueling itself into an even greater frenzy. Warehouses filled with spirits and oils didn't just burn. Massive detonations thundered through the night, sending shockwaves that shattered windows for miles and rained down a shower of flaming debris. The sky above Lower Manhattan glowed a hellish orange, a beacon of destruction visible from as far away as Philadelphia. The smoke was so thick it blotted out the stars, swallowing entire neighborhoods in a choking, black cloud. The roar of the fire was deafening, a constant, consuming sound that drowned out everything else. For the people of New York, this wasn't just a spectacle. It was the end of their world. Panic ripped through the streets as the fire advanced with terrifying speed. People fled their homes in the middle of the night, grabbing whatever they could carry: a few clothes, a family portrait, a small bag of valuables. Merchants, some of the wealthiest men in America, stood on the edges of the inferno, watching helplessly as their entire fortunes, their life's work, went up in smoke. The financial heart of the nation, Wall Street and the surrounding district, was being erased from the map, block by agonizing block. The fight was no longer about saving the city. It was about surviving the night. The question had changed from what could be saved to whether anything could be saved at all. As the fire line advanced relentlessly, city leaders and firefighters realized their conventional methods were a complete failure. They were losing. In this moment of pure desperation, a radical and terrifying plan was formed. If they couldn't put the fire out, they would have to starve it. They decided to fight fire, or rather, with gunpowder. The strategy was to create a firebreak, a wide-open gap that the flames could not cross. This meant intentionally destroying perfectly good buildings that stood in the fire's path. It was a brutal form of urban surgery, tearing down a part of the city to save the rest. Marines were called in from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, bringing with them barrels of gunpowder. They began the systematic demolition of the city's own structures. They placed explosive charges in buildings ahead of the fire and detonated them. The explosions were immense, adding to the chaos and terror of the night. Entire blocks of beautiful, multi-story buildings were blown to pieces, reduced to rubble in an instant. It was a horrifying sight. New York tearing itself apart in a last-ditch effort to survive. The explosions continued for hours, a percussive, thunderous beat against the roar of the flames. It was a gamble, a massive, destructive gamble, but it was the only one they had left. Slowly, painfully, the desperate strategy began to work. The massive fire breaks created by the gunpowder explosions finally gave the exhausted firefighters a line they could hold. The fire, which had seemed unstoppable, hit the wide-open spaces and began to lose its momentum. Its fuel source was cut off. The fire, starved and contained, began to burn itself out. The immediate danger was over, but the silence that followed was just as terrifying as the roar had been. 17 blocks of the city, the commercial and financial core of America, were gone. Nearly 700 buildings had been destroyed. The area was a smoking, smoldering wasteland of charred timbers and collapsed brick walls. It looked like a city that had been bombed. The financial losses were staggering, equivalent to billions of dollars today. Insurance companies, facing an avalanche of claims they could never pay, went bankrupt overnight. The economic heart of the country had been ripped out. In the cold light of day, New Yorkers walked through the ruins, stunned into silence. The city that had felt so invincible just 24 hours earlier was now on its knees. Yet, this is not a story about the end of New York. It's a story about its resilience. In the aftermath of the ashes, the city didn't just rebuild, it reinvented itself. The narrow wooden streets were replaced with wider avenues. New building codes demanded fire-resistant materials like stone and iron. A new professional fire department was established, and a reliable water system, the Croton Aqueduct, was constructed to ensure the city would never be so vulnerable again. The Great Fire of 1835 was a catastrophe, a trial by fire in the truest sense. But from those ashes rose a stronger, safer, and more modern New York. The very city we know today. It was a brutal lesson, but one that forged the future of a metropolis. Thanks for watching.